by Albert Camus. O my soul, do not aspire to immortal life, but exhaust the limits of the possible. Pindar, Pythian. The pages that follow deal with an absurd sensitivity that can be found widespread in the age, and not with an absurd philosophy which our time, properly speaking, has not known. It is therefore simply fair to point out that, at the outset, what these pages owe to certain contemporary thinkers. It is so far from my intention to hide this that they will be found cited and commented upon throughout this work. But it is useful to note at the same time that the absurd, hitherto taken as a conclusion, is considered in this essay as a starting point. In this sense, it may be said that there is something provisional in my commentary. One cannot prejudge the position it entails. There will be found here merely the description in the pure state of an intellectual malady. No metaphysic, no belief is involved in it for the moment. There are certain limits, and the only bias of this book, these are the limits, and the only bias of this book, rather. Certain personal experiences urge me to make this clear. All right, so those were his notes before he begins the book. An absurd reasoning. Absurdity and suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are the games. One must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. If I ask myself how to judge that this question is more urgent than that, I reply that one judges by the actions it entails. I've never seen anyone die for the ontological argument. Galileo, who held a scientific truth of great importance, abjured it with the greatest ease as soon as it endangered his life. In a certain sense, he did right. That truth was not worth the stake. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. How to answer it? On all essential problems, I mean thereby those that run the risk of leading to death or those that intensify the passion of living, there are probably but 2 methods of thought. The method of Lapalisse and the method of Don Quixote. I don't know that reference, Lapalisse. You will look that up. Solely the balance between evidence and lyricism can allow us to achieve simultaneously emotion and lucidity. In a subject at once so humble and so heavy with emotion, the learned and classical dialectic must yield. One can see to a more modest attitude of mind deriving at one and the same time from common sense and understanding. Suicide has never been dealt with except as a social phenomenon. On the contrary, we are here concerned at the outset with the relationship between individual thought and suicide. An act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, as is a great work of art. The man himself is ignorant of it. One evening he pulls the trigger or jumps. Of an apartment building manager who had killed himself, I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that he had changed greatly since, and that the experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. Society has but little connection with such beginnings. The worm is in man's heart. That is where it must be sought. One must follow and understand this fatal game that leads from lucidity in the face of existence to flight from light. There are many causes for a suicide, and generally the most obvious ones were not the most powerful. Rarely is suicide committed, yet the hypothesis is not excluded through reflection. What sets off the crisis is almost always unverifiable. Newspapers often speak of personal sorrows or of incurable illness. These explanations are plausible, but one would have to know whether a friend of the desperate man had not that very day addressed him indifferently. He is the guilty one, or that is enough to precipitate all the rancors and all the boredom still in suspension. Let us not miss this opportunity. There's a bullet point or a citation. Let us not miss this opportunity to point out the relative character of this essay. Suicide may indeed be related to much more honorable considerations. For example, the political suicides of protests, as they were called during the Chinese Revolution, the self-immolation. But if it is hard to fix the precise instant, the subtle step when the mind opted for death, it is easier to deduce from the act itself the consequences it implies. In a sense, as in a melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you or that you do not understand it. Now, let's not go too far into analogies, however, but rather return to everyday words. It is merely confessing. It is merely confessing that is not worth the trouble. Living naturally is never easy. You continue making the gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the usefulness of suffering. So what then is the incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. All healthy men having thought of their suicide, it can be seen, without further explanation, that there is a direct connection between this feeling and the longing for death. The subject of this essay is precisely this relationship between the absurd and suicide, the exact degree to which suicide is a solution to the absurd. The principle can be established that for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his actions. Belief in the absurdity of existence must then dictate his conduct. It is legitimate to wonder, clearly and without false pathos, whether a conclusion of this importance requires forsaking as rapidly as possible an incomprehensible condition. I am speaking, of course, of men inclined to be in harmony with themselves. Stated clearly, this problem may seem both simple and insoluble, but it is wrongly assumed that simple questions involve answers that are no less simple and that evidence implies evidence. A priori and reversing the terms of the problem, just as one does or does not kill oneself, it seems that there are but two philosophical solutions, either yes or no. This would be too easy, but allowance must be made for those who, without concluding, continue questioning. Here I am only slightly indulging in irony that this is the majority. I notice also that those who answer no act as if they thought yes. As a matter of fact, if I accept the Nietzschean criterion, they think yes in one way or another. On the other hand, it often happens that those who commit suicide were assured of the meaning of life. The contradictions are constant. It may be even said that they had never been so keen as on this point where, on the contrary, logic seems so desirable. It is a commonplace to compare philosophical theories and the behavior of those who profess them, but it must be said that of the thinkers who refused a meaning to life, none except Kirillov, who belongs to literature, Peregrinos, who is born of legend, and Jules Lequier, who belongs to a hypothesis, admitted his logic to the point of refusing that life. Schopenhauer is often cited as a fit subject for laughter because he praised suicide while seated at a well-set table. This is no subject for joking. That way of taking the tragic seriously is not so. That way of not taking the tragic seriously is not so grievous, but it helps to judge a man. In the face of such contradictions and obscurities, must we conclude that there is no relationship between the opinion one has about life and the act one commits to leave it? For those of us joining us, playing the home game, we are reading The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus. We're just a few pages in. Let us not exaggerate in this direction. In a man's attachment to life, there is something stronger than all the ills in the world. The body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation. We get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking. In that race which daily hastens us toward death, the body maintains its irreparable lead. In short, the essence of that contradiction lies in what I shall call the act of eluding, because it is both less and more than diversion in the Pascalian sense. Eluding is the invariable game. The typical act of eluding, the fateful evasion that constitutes the third theme of this essay, is hope. Hope of another life one must deserve, or trickery of those who live not for life itself, but for some great idea that will transcend it, refine it, give it meaning, and betray it. Thus, everything contributes to spreading confusion. Hitherto, it has not been wasted effort. People have played on words and pretended to believe that refusing to grant a meaning to life necessarily leads to declaring that life is not worth living. In truth, there is no necessary common measure between these two judgments. One merely has to refuse to be misled by the confusions, divorces, and inconsistencies previously pointed out. One must brush everything aside and go straight to the real problem. One kills oneself because life is not worth living. That is certainly a truth. Yet it is an unfruitful one because it is a truism. Does that insult to existence, that flat denial in which it is plunged, come from the fact that it has no meaning? Does its absurdity require one to escape it through hope or suicide? This is what must be clarified, hunted down, and elucidated while brushing aside all the rest. Does the absurd dictate death? This problem must be given priority over others, outside of all methods of thought and all exercises of the disinterested mind. Shades of meaning, contradictions, the psychology that an objective mind can always introduce into all problems have no place in the pursuit and this passion. It calls simply for an unjust, in other words, logical, thought. That is not easy. It is always easy to be logical. It is almost impossible to be logical to the bitter end. It is almost impossible to be logical to the bitter end. Men who die by their own hand consequently follow to its conclusion their emotional inclination. Reflection on suicide gives me an opportunity to raise the only problem to interest me. Is there a logic to the point of death? I cannot know unless I pursue, without reckless passion, in the sole light of evidence, the reasoning of which I am here suggesting the source. This is what I call an absurd reasoning. Many have begun it. I do not know yet whether they kept it. When Karl Jaspers, revealing the impossibility of constituting the world as a unity, exclaims, "This limitation leads me to myself," where I can no longer withdraw behind an objective point of view that I am merely representing, where neither I myself nor the existence of others can any longer become an object for me. He is evoking, after many others, those waterless deserts where thought reaches its confines. After many others, yes indeed, but how eager they were to get out of them. At last, that crossroad where thought hesitates, many men have arrived, even some of the humblest. They even abdicated what was most precious to them, their life. Others, princes of the mind, abdicated likewise, but they initiated the suicide of their thought in its purest revolt. The real effort is to stay there, rather insofar as that it is possible, and to examine closely the odd vegetation of those distant regions. I love this analogy, this metaphor he's using. Tenacity and acumen are privileged spectators of this inhuman show in which absurdity, hope, and death carry on the dialogue. The mind can then analyze the figures of that elementary yet subtle dance before illustrating them and reliving them itself. Like Absurd Walls, new chapter, Absurd Walls. Got about 8 more minutes here. Like great works, deep feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying. The regularity of an impulse or a repulsion in a soul is encountered again in habits of doing or thinking, is reproduced in consequences of which the soul itself knows nothing. Great feelings take with them their own universe, splendid or abject. That's true. Great feelings take with them their own universe. They do. They light up with their passion an exclusive world in which they recognize their climate. There is a universe of jealousy, of ambition, of selfishness, or of generosity. A universe, in other words, a metaphysic and an attitude of mind. What is true of already specialized feelings will be even more so of emotions, basically as indeterminate, simultaneously vague, as definite, as remote, as present, as those furnished us by beauty and aroused by absurdity. At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face. As it is, in its distressing nudity, in its light with effulgence. Oh, why am I tripping over that word there? In light without effulgence, it is elusive, but that very difficulty deserves reflection. It is probably true that a man remains forever unknown to us, and that there is in him something irreducible that escapes us. But practically, I know men and recognize them by their behavior, by the totality of their deeds, by the consequences caused in life by their presence. Love Camus. By the consequences caused in life by their presence, right? What consequences in life do you cause when you go out into the world? Are you causing happy ripples? Are you planting happy seeds to sprout happy trees, right? Are we cultivating happiness and joy in the world with people we meet, or are we rubbing them the wrong way and cultivating bitterness? Where did it go? Likewise, all those irrational feelings which offer no purchase to analysis, I can define them practically, appreciate them practically, by gathering together the sum of their consequences in the domain of the intelligence, by seizing and noting all of their aspects, by outlining their universe. It is certain that, apparently, though I have seen the same actor 100 times, I shall not for that same reason know him any better personally. Yet if I add up the heroes he has personified, and if I say that I know him a little better at the 100th character counted off, this will be felt to contain an element of truth. For this apparent paradox is also an apology. There's a moral to it. It's an apologue. It teaches that a man defines himself by his make-believe, as well as by his sincere impulses. Repeat that. It teaches that a man defines himself by his make-believe, as well as by his sincere impulses. There is thus a lower key of feelings, inaccessible to the heart, but partially disclosed by the acts they imply, and the attitudes of mind they assume. It is clear that in this way I am defining a method, but it is also evident that the method is one of analysis and not of knowledge. For methods imply metaphysics. Unconsciously they disclose conclusions that they often claim not to know yet. Similarly, the last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages. Such a link is inevitable. The method defined here acknowledges the feeling that all true knowledge is impossible. Solely appearances can be enumerated and the climate make itself felt. Perhaps we shall be able to overtake that elusive feeling of absurdity in the different but closely related worlds of intelligence, of the art of living, or of art itself. The claim of absurdity is in the beginning. The end is the absurd universe, and that attitude of mind which lights the world with its true colors to bring out the privileged and impalpable visage which that attitude has discerned in it. Lovely. So there's a stopping point there, and I'm going to stop right there. We will come back to that tomorrow, page 12. Yeah. The absurdity of the world. That's why I love absurd theater. That's why I love Eugene Ionescu and Beckett. The absurdity, right? The absurdity of life. The absurdity of us and our feelings and our big feelings and our big thoughts and ideas in a universe that ultimately, based on what we know, he doesn't care, but also won't be around very long, cosmologically speaking, for anyone to know, Right? I was just reading the article the other day, 800 billion years, or 800 million years from now, rather, 800 million years from now, the brightness of the earth, the sun is going to cook off the earth, right? The oxygen going to plummet, carbon dioxide is going to plummet, and that'll be that. The plants are going to die off. No more photosynthesis. And yeah, that'll be that. So there we go. So knowing that absurdity, here we sit, here I talk with you, my friends, trying to have a happy day, right? If I can't take it with me, if this is all I know, well then I got to try to make the best of it, right? I got to try to be happy in the process. I got to try to enjoy the process and not the journey, because you may never get to the journey. Who knows if you'll arrive, which means that the squeeze may all be all we ever know. What if you never get to taste the juice, right? What if all you do is squeeze, 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 and you never taste the juice? Well, then it would help to enjoy the squeeze, wouldn't it? I will leave you with that, my friends. Much love. I appreciate all of you. Until tomorrow, have a wonderful day. Have a happy, happy day. And I appreciate you. Have a good one. Talk to you soon, friends.